And we are back with another edition of Indicator Plants of BC. This time, Group 4, Shrubbery. You want a shrubbery? I brought you some shrubbery. So, before we begin, let's just talk really quickly about what are shrubs. Basically, shrubs are woody plants, plants that produce wood. This is opposed to herbs, which are non-woody plants. Because shrubs produce wood, they are often able to grow a little bit bigger. They've got a little bit more structural support and better vascularity going on there. Herbs tend to be a little bit smaller. Because shrubs are a bit bigger and herbs are a bit smaller, we'll talk about this later in the course, but they're often divided into the shrub layer of the understory and the herb layer of the understory. Sometimes these definitions are a little bit looser and they're defined really operationally. So if you look at a lot of the land management handbooks for British Columbia, shrubs will basically be kind of larger understory plants, while herbs are smaller understory plants, regardless of whether they're woody or not. For the purposes of this course, though, shrubs are woody plants, herbs are non-woody plants. With that out of the way, what are the little subgroupings that we have this week? Well, we have a variety of fine rhododendrons, we have some big shrubs / small trees, and we have one annoying little sticky herb to talk about right at the end. Starting off, we'll do some big shrubs / small trees. And the very first one is going to be our Sitka alder, Alnus sinuata. If you stick this genus here, Alnus, the alders, if you stick with forestry, if you continue with your forestry education, or if you start to work as a forester, you're gonna, in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, you're gonna get to know this genus really well, because the alders are some of the most important deciduous trees in the Pacific Northwest. The reason for that is because they form these symbiotic associations with lots of little nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots. In these little root nodules, there's little bacteria that live that will actually fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil. So from an ecological perspective, alders are super, super important for soil nutrients in the Pacific Northwest, wherever they're found. Now, our Sitka alder. So this is kind of a small tree. I believe it maxes out about 20 feet tall or so. What is that? Like 4 or 5 like 5 meters or something like that. And the thing about alders in general, they're really effective cereal species. So you find these in lots of really exposed sites. Say you have a clear cut or a landslide, some type of disturbance just wipes out the overstory. You have this exposed site, you're going to have lots of alders, including the Sitka alder, that pop up right away. And that's what you can kind of see in this photo to the right here, is there's been some kind of disturbance, you've got this big cleared area, and then you get this big thicket of alders that pop up afterwards, and they tend to grow in this really tight bunch, kind of like that. So how are we going to distinguish our Sitka alder from some of the other alders that we find out there? The key thing is to look at the edges of the leaf, or the leaf margins. So look at the margin of this leaf here. When we have teeth or kind of a saw shape like this on the edge, we call that a serrate margin. Now sometimes you'll have teeth, tiny teeth, on top of bigger teeth, and that's called being doubly serrate or double serrate. Well, Sitka alder are notable for being double serrate. They've got these little teeth on top of the bigger teeth. And that's a good way to distinguish them from things such as the red alder, which is another really common species to find in kind of southern British Columbia. And the red alder, look at the leaf margin here. It tends to be wavier. And while it's got a few little bumps going on, it's not double serrate in the same way that the Sitka alder is. The Sitka alder looks really aggressive and spiky, like a buzzsaw like that. Size-wise, this leaf here is going to be about the palm of your hand to about the size of your hand for reference. Now let's look at some of the reproductive structures. So quite notably, alders produce their flowers in a type of inflorescence, a type of compound flower, like a big cluster of little flowers, called a catkin. And so you've got these male catkins which dangle down like that, and this is a big cluster of teeny tiny little flowers there. And then you've got the female flowers which are more upright, and they're sticking up like that. And so the males produce the pollen, goes into the females, fertilization occurs, and the females will harden up and become all woody like this. And then once all the scales on these tiny little cones open, then they release the seeds. And these little seeds here, they're so teeny tiny, they're like grains of dust, really, really small. And this is actually a type of seed called a winged nutlet. So in the middle here, you've got this little tiny kind of microscopic nut, and then these are the wings on either side like that. And so this is dispersed by the wind, and because it's so small, it can go really, really far on the wind. Next species, we have another kind of small tree. We have Cascara, Rhamnus purshiana. So Rhamnus, this is in the Rhamnaceae family, which are the buckthorns. Just for a little bit of trivia. You find this one in lots of kind of wet sites. Yeah, so you find this one in the understories of really, really wet forests. And a little bit of ethnobotany about our Cascara. Apparently, you can, a good folk remedy was you can take the bark, boil it, make a really disgusting tea, which if you drink is a super powerful laxative. And so if you're a little bit stopped up, you need to, unclog yourself, uncork the champagne, then you can, drink that tea and that'll help you out. Apparently, this was actually used in over-the-counter medications at one point before the Food and Drug Administration in the US put a stop to that for, silly reasons like risk of like heart problems and just silly stuff like that. But apparently another use for this was because it's so disgusting tasting, you could actually put it on like a kid's fingernails if they were biting their nails, and they would stop that. Whether they stopped because it was disgusting tasting or because it would make them violently go to the bathroom, who knows, but pretty effective. Let's have a look at the leaves of this. So the leaves are a great way to distinguish your Cascara. They tend to occur in these big splays right at the end there, right at the end of the branches. And the leaves are notable, they're really smooth and glossy looking. A lot of leaves tend to look like our alders, a lot of the leaves tend to be kind of dull. They might even be like a little bit fuzzy. The Cascara leaf is really notable for being really glossy, and you can see how shiny it is in these photos here. It's also a very three-dimensional looking leaf. So between the veins that are coming out like this, look at, it almost has like this washboard texture. So yeah, it's a very three-dimensional looking leaf, kind of these ribs that appear on it. And then look around the edges of the leaf as well. The edges of the leaf, the margin is what we call entire. And that basically means that it's just smooth. It's not wavy, it's not serrated, nothing exciting like that going on. It's just this big smooth leaf. Size-wise, these will go from about the size of your hand to the size of your foot. Some of the reproductive structures of the Cascara. On the left here, you can see the flowers. Another great way to distinguish this from different alders. So remember the alders, the flowers were those catkins. The Cascara, the flowers, they're a lot more conventional looking and just in these big bunches in amongst the leaves there. They're not that exciting. You can see, I think those are the sepals there. They look like really tiny little starfish to me, actually. You've got kind of these 5 sort of fused sepals, little structures like that. Makes it look like a little tiny little starfish. Super cute. But once those are fertilized, they produce these fruits. This is a type of fruit called a drupe. And a drupe is a little bit like a cherry. It's got a little pit in the middle there, which contains the seeds. Apparently you can eat, apparently these fruits are edible, but they're not amazing. And they'll also make you go to the bathroom, kind of like the bark will. So I would, it doesn't seem worth it to me unless that's what you're really going for. But yeah, they produce the younger fruits tend to be more red in color. Later on, they get like this deep kind of purple, like black cherry color almost. Now, just a little trivia about the Cascara as well, and this is super nerdy and botanical, so skip ahead if you're not into that. But a lot of plants on the buds, the little parts that will eventually grow into new leaves and new shoots, they're protected by scales. Cascara is notable because it has naked buds. There's no scales protecting it. The little primordial parts, the little cells in there are just kind of wide open. So it's living the vida loca. And another plant, red osier dogwood, Cornus sericea. So while the Sitka alder, while the Cascara, those were more like small trees, red osier dogwood is kind of just this big, crazy-looking bush. Just this, it gets to be quite large. Just this big, willowy-looking bush. Unpacking the name a little bit, red. The redness is a really important way to potentially identify this. So look at the photo right below the title there, and you can see these stems here. And the new stems of the red osier dogwood tend to be this really bright red color. And that's an important way to identify it. Say if you're in the middle of winter, it doesn't have any flowers, doesn't have any leaves, still have these bright red stems that you can tell this plant apart from others. Osier. Apparently an osier is like a really old-fashioned name for a type of willow that would be used for weaving baskets and weaving wicker. And so that gives you a picture of what to look for with this plant as well. It produces all these really willowy, thin, flexible stems that maybe you could use to potentially weave something if you were so crafty. And then the dogwoods. Dogwoods are, they're a pretty notable genus of plants in the Pacific Northwest. Cornus are the dogwoods. And the way that I remember that Cornus are dogwoods, my girlfriend taught this to me actually, is that dogs are corny. So there you go, corny old dogs. You tend to find your red osier dogwood in kind of damper areas. You can find it alongside creeks and riparian habitats like this. Also, I see it alongside logging roads often, kind of in the damper parts of the ditches as well. So good spots to look out for it. Okay, looking at some of the flowers for this guy. So this is what an individual little red osier dogwood flower looks like. Kind of a pretty little thing. It's got the 4 petals there. And then the stamens and the stigma are really big compared to the rest of the plant. So these teeny tiny little flowers, these little white flowers, occur in these clusters here. And it's a flat-topped cluster. If you want to get technical and botanical, this is called an umbel. The kind of this flat-topped cluster like this that occurs in amongst the branches. Now, I just wanted to include a few other dogwood photos so that you can compare the flowers to those. So dogwoods tend to have this really distinctive type of looking flower. At the top here, you've got a bunchberry. That's another plant that we're going to talk about in the course. Down here, Pacific dogwood, that's actually the official flower of British Columbia. And you'll notice that these look pretty similar, these two flowers, and they look really different from this. So what's the deal? Well, the key thing to notice is that the flowers for these two are actually clusters in the middle like that. So here's one cluster of flowers there. There's another cluster of flowers here. And these white structures, which look like petals, that's actually a big crazy type of leaf called a bract. So your red osier dogwood, it actually has really similar looking flowers to these. It just doesn't have the big white bracts that make these look really distinctive. Just a little food for thought. And having a look at the berries of this thing. It's got those flowers will grow into these little white berries. Not too exciting, not too delicious. There you go. Next up, our rhododendrons, plus the faker. The copperbush is not a rhododendron, but we want to throw it in just because it looks so similar to some of the others. A few words about rhododendrons. Rhododendrons it's a genus of shrub, and they're really common landscape plants kind of around the Pacific Northwest. You see lots of Pacific rhododendrons around UBC, and they produce these really huge, beautiful, kind of purpley red or white flowers. They have all kinds of different colors, but really they're notable. This is a group of plants that's usually notable for producing quite beautiful flowers. And then they've got these really kind of flaky looking woody stems, and all of the leaves tend to be sort of clustered in these whirly looking bunches at the tips. So just a few words about rhododendrons there. Our first species, Labrador tea, Rhododendron groenlandicum. How do I remember that Labrador tea has this scientific name? Well, Labrador is a cold island in the North Atlantic. Greenland is also a cold island in the North Atlantic. There you go. There's tea in the name of this. You can actually make a tea out of this. You take the leaves and to do that. And apparently it's really good for like colds and that sort of like mild respiratory illness that you get in winter. But where you find this, notice really wet soil moisture regime. It's got poor nutrients. You see this a lot in boggy areas where the soil is poor, where there's lots of standing water, and it will grow all over the place in spots like bogs. This plant that grows in these really dense thickets that are about waist high. So how do we identify our Labrador tea? Of all the rhododendrons, this is probably the easiest one to tell apart because it has really distinctive looking leaves. So check out these leaves. First of all, they're really kind of hairy all over the place, but look at the margins, look at the edges of the leaf, and see how they're rolled underneath like that. And it almost gives them kind of this cylindrical appearance. They're kind of really curled up at the edges there. And that's really distinctive amongst all of the plants that we look at. I don't think any other plants in this course have leaves that are really curled up quite like that. But on the underside of the leaf as well, really distinctive looking, is all this fuzz. This orange stuff, those are copper colored hairs. And so the Labrador tea, it'll produce these white hairs kind of on younger leaves, and then as it gets older, they'll turn this really deep kind of orangey, rusty color. And this is a good thing for is you can tell this apart from another plant called trapper's tea, which also grows in bogs. But Labrador tea you can make a nice tea out of. Trapper's tea, apparently if you make something tea out of it, it'll make you really nauseous. So you don't really want to use that. Moving on to the flowers. Flowers grow on the tip of the plant there. This is something that we call a terminal inflorescence, when you get a big bunch of flowers growing on the very end of the plant. And yeah, kind of these big straggly looking flowers. This will be about the size of a toonie, like a $1 or $2 coin that you find in Canada. And kind of these rounded, wavy looking petals, 5 petals on each plant. It's got this big crazy splay of stamens there, these little orange colored bits on the ends of the stamens. So yeah, kind of these funny looking white flowers. Most important thing to focus on though with these plants is the leaves. That's how you tell it apart. Next up, white flowered rhododendron. Rhododendron albiflorum. Let's take a minute to unpack this Latin name. Albiflorum, albi is Latin for white, florum is flower, so this name literally translates to white flowered rhododendron. Now the Labrador tea we just looked at, you find that in bogs. White flowered rhododendron, yeah, you find this one in drier environments. So yeah, very, very different than the Labrador tea that we were just looking at. Still likes those poor soils, however. And let's look, first of all, at why this plant has its name. It's because it produces these really beautiful white flowers. They have 5 petals, but They're so close together, they almost look like they're fused into like this cup shape, but really attractive little flowers. And it's got these white stamens going around the middle there. Yeah, and just the flowers occur in kind of this little cluster right on the edges of the branches there, just underneath the splay of leaves. The leaves themselves, they're not too exciting. They're kind of wavy around the edges. They've got lots of veins all over the place. They've got a little bit of fuzz on top there. Rhododendrons on the whole tend to have like a little bit of kind of these sticky, hairy little leaves. But yeah, and so that's one thing to note with the white flowered rhododendron there. And what will those flowers turn into when they are fertilized? Believe it or not, this is actually the fruit. This is a cluster of little dry capsules there. So not a super, yeah, not too exciting. Just kind of this funny little cluster of capsules. Okay, next up, false azalea, Rhododendron menziesii. Let's take a hot minute to look at the scientific name. Menziesii, this is a species name that you see pop up over and over again. We've got Pseudotsuga menziesii, that's Douglas fir, one of the main tree species in the Pacific Northwest. There's also Arbutus menziesii, Madrona menziesii, that's the Arbutus tree, which is another really important tree species in the Pacific Northwest. What menziesii refers to is a botanist named Archibald Menzies, who sailed with Captain George Vancouver all up and down the coast of the Pacific Northwest in kind of the 1700s or early 1800s. And he really kind of cataloged a lot of the species that were here. So that's why you see that name pop up over and over again. But kind of like look at the soil moisture, the soil nutrients. You find false azalea in a lot of the same places as you find the white-flowered rhododendron, and this is the plant that probably looks most similar to the white-flowered rhododendron in this course. And so we really want to be able to distinguish between those two species. Now, if the flowers are around, it's really easy to distinguish between false azalea and white-flowered rhododendron. Because remember, white-flowered rhododendron, those beautiful white flowers, kind of a cup shape. False azalea produces these little pink bell-shaped flowers here. It looks a lot more like the flowers of like a blueberry bush or a huckleberry bush. These little these 2 or 3 groupings of pink bell-shaped droopy flowers. But say that the flowers aren't around, then you're going to want to distinguish between these two species by using the leaves. And the key thing to look for there is the midvein. So your false azalea, it has the midvein, and it's poking out of the very tip of the leaf there. White-flowered rhododendron, it's not poking out of the tip of the leaf, and so that's what you're going to want to look for. Otherwise, false azalea also, it tends to be a little bit hairier than the white-flowered rhododendron, but the main thing to look for is that protruding leaf vein, midvein. And finally, our copperbush, Elliottia pyroliflora. This is not a rhododendron, but it looks so similar that we want to talk about it here because we want to be able to distinguish between it and some of the others. Where you find this copperbush, it refers to the fact it's got these copper-colored flowers that, it's a really, when it's flowering, it's really quite a lovely plant. And you find this one in lots of really mountainous environments. Where I see a lot of this is I'm rock climbing and I'm going up some big cliff in the middle of somewhere and I get to like a tiny little ledge. I'll often find copperbush and it's like, wow, I cannot believe that this tough little plant is growing in a place like this. Good on you, copperbush. So let's look at the leaves of the copperbush versus the others. So this is one that can get really easily confused, but we want to look at some of the details there. Now I've kind of laid it out really nicely what to look for. So the copperbush, it doesn't have any hairs on it. It's quite a bit smoother. It's not, this photo makes it look really shiny. It's actually more what botanists call glaucous. That means it's got kind of this waxy, powdery texture going on with it. It also has just kind of one prominent single vein going down the middle versus your white-flowered rhododendron, which has veins all over the place, and false azalea has, you can see the veins coming out as well. And then it doesn't have the protruding midvein here versus the false azalea, which does have the protruding midvein. So it's really a much plainer looking leaf than either of the other two. And you can kind of review that to really tell the difference between all of these species. Now, once again, if the flowers are around though, this is a really easy plant this is a really distinctive looking plant. Check out this flower. Check out that crazy looking stigma in the middle. It looks like a Dr. Seuss flower. The stigma is just poking out and wraps around like an elephant's trunk or like some wild flugelhorn thing. And then it's got the beautiful petals coming around the outside as well. It's a really attractive looking flower when you find it. And this is kind of a small little flower. So this will be maybe a little bit bigger than your $2 Canadian coin, like about that kind of thing. Now, say that flower gets fertilized, the petals are going to drop off, and this is what the fruit looks like pretty early after fertilization. You can see it's got the ovary here, and it still has that big crazy stigma poking out, so it looks really funny and distinctive still. And then as the fruit matures, it turns into these dried capsules though. And so all these, you can actually see the little segments that are going to turn into these capsules. And so those dry out and then they split apart to release the seeds. Finally, the one herb that we have in this group, sweet-scented bedstraw, Galium triflorum. Sweet-scented bedstraw, the name makes it sound like a really pleasant plant, but apparently, especially more in eastern North America, this can be a really noxious weed that just spreads out of control and takes over the place. Yeah, and it's just kind of this really funny it is quite pretty though. It's this funny little delicate plant that just kind of goes along the ground like this. And yeah, find this one in lots of, once again, lots of kind of damp environments. So looking at the leaves of this thing, the leaves have these really fine little tiny hairs on them like this. But they're kind of individually, they're kind of these plain looking leaves. Like they don't have really strong veins or anything like that. But the way that they grow makes them look really distinctive. So the way that they grow is in groups of 6 in these big whorls. And if we're talking about botany, a whorl is when you have more than 2 leaves coming out of one point on a plant, basically. So if you have 2 leaves, we call that having opposite leaves. When you have but then you can have a whorl, which is more than 2 leaves. And so we've got groups of 6 leaves growing like this here. And they'll grow in these successive areas. So you've got one whorl coming out of the bottom there, and then another whorl further up. And yeah, it's very distinctive. There's no other plant in this course that looks quite like your sweet-scented bedstraw. Now, when we get to the reproductive structures here, maybe we can think back about that scientific name, Galium triflorum. Triflorum means 3 flowers, and that's one thing to look at. You tend to have maybe 2 of these stalks of flowers, and it has 3 little tiny flowers growing out of each stalk like that. And those will grow out just above the leaves like this here. But on the bottom of the flower, you can see the ovary here, and it's got all these little spikes sticking out. And then when it's fertilized, it's going to turn into this fruit right here. And this is a burr. So this is a little fruit. The little fruit, the seed is inside there, and it's got all these little hairs on the outside. And you can see actually in this photo, they've got hooks on the end. And so if say an animal or a person, especially a person's socks, goes past, it's going to stick into that, and that's how it gets spread all over the place. And that's what makes this, really an annoying plant. You get all these little seeds stuck everywhere. It's not very good. That is all for this group. Go onto Patrick Culbert's site, do some review quizzes, come into a lab session and do some review in person, and see you next time.